Well, this is Jenny with Norna's Scraps, and today I'm going to be sharing with you a method that I have been testing for quite a long time now, probably several months, on how I create a quilt block in my hoop using Stitch Artist, and this can be done on Stitch Artist 1, 2, or 3. I purchase a lot of quilt in the hoop designs, I've got to be honest. However, sometimes they just simply do not address what I want to do. And that's where this technique is going to come into play and hopefully help you get your sea legs wet and create your own quilt in the hoop designs. So how am I going to do that? The first thing I'm going to do is open a new design page, and then I'm going to choose the toggle that shows my preferences. It's the yellow one. And I'm going to set my hoop. For my Janome, I choose the ASQ 220 by 220, and that's the 8-inch square quilting hoop, which I simply love. Apply it and select OK. I am now going to move to my Create Design window, and I do that by selecting this toggle, the one that looks like a bit of zigzag stitching. And you can see that my tools have changed. I have a lot of tools. Please don't be worried if you don't have this many. I do have Stitch Artist 3, and I have several other of the Embrilliance softwares. The next thing I'm going to do, since I'm prepared to create my designs, I have done nothing yet, no objects, no colors. I'm going to go to the library, and I'm going to click on the flower and scroll down to my Basic Shapes 1. This is in the Embrilliance Outlines, and I'm going to select my square. Click on it and select OK. And obviously it doesn't come in at 8 inches, but we'll fix that shortly. The next step in this process is I have to do two different things. First, I'm going to set my running stitch, and I'm not worrying about the size yet. And I'm going to select my color. Now, for this particular part of my design, I'm just going to leave it the orange. But did you see what I did? I clicked on color and I came up with a color menu. Now, the next step, I'm going to move my beginning, not that. I'm going to hover over the little green bow, move my cursor around, and when you see the little bow pop up, the green one, I'm going to slide it to the center. Do the same with the red bow. The green is the starting of my stitching, and the red is the ending of my stitching. I don't want it in the corner, and the reason I don't is because it tends to ravel a little bit more quickly. This particular stitched square is not going to show on the outside of your quilt. Now, let me say that again. It's not going to show. This is a placement stitch. The next step, or the next thing I need to do in this whole process, is return to my Create menu. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to select my orange square object, design number 1, and I'm going to move to the sizing bracket. Make sure my little lockbox, scale proportionately, is locked, and I am going to select one of my measurements, and I'm going to type in 8 inches. And I'm going to select or press on my keyboard, return. And my block snaps to the 8-inch size. I'm going to click off of my design, and now I am going to start manipulating this particular design. And the reason I'm going to do that is I'm going to create a placement stitch for my batting, and then a tacking stitch for my batting. So let's change this, the name, by double clicking on it to outline. Real simple. Just so in this process I can keep them straight, because heaven knows I haven't in the past. So now I'm going to select the outline, and I'm going to copy it. That would be Command-C on my Mac or Control-C on my PC. And I'm going to paste it, Command-V, as in vary, on my Mac, or Control-V on my PC. And in my objects menu, you can see I now have a second outline. I am going to decrease the size of this outline by 1/8 of an inch. And that you'll see what I'm going to do in a second. So again, with this particular object selected, I'm going to make sure my lock is closed, and I'm going to come up to one of my measurements and type in 7 7/8. This object has to be 1/8 of an inch smaller than the first one. So I've typed in my numbers in the Embrilliance format. So press enter, and you can see that that box has now decreased in size. So what am I going to do with this? I am going to, it is also called outline. We're going to change that. Double click on my object, and I'm going to put batting placement. And really, I don't need a second object here, although I said it earlier and I apologize for the confusion, because when I'm creating this, I'm going to stitch this outline, and everything that I do will be larger than this outline. So every piece of fabric, every component of my quilt block is larger than 8 inches. But I get to that in another video, so hang on for that one. Here's my batting placement. And I'm going to change the color because I definitely want a color stop between this. So I click on my color, and let's change this one to a burgundy color. And I click off screen. The next thing I'm going to do in this menu is I'm going to select my outline again, and it should already be copied unless I've closed out of this, but just in case, I'm going to copy it, Command C, Control C, and I'm going to paste, click on outside my hoop, Command V, Control V to place it. Now I'm going to again select it and change my color. Let's go with a green. Say OK. This particular outline is going to be my fabric holding stitch. And that is the basis for creating a quilt in the hoop block. The basis. However, the technique of actually creating that first block is coming next. Okay, before we go on to actually stitching this quilt block out, let's create the guide for the quilting of the block. Now, where this guide sits in your quilt block is totally up to you. It also depends on how you want to finish the quilt block that you've created in the hoop. If you're going to finish it in the style similar to Sweet Pea or Anita Good Design, where you piece the block and then you add one backing, you can actually do edge-to-edge quilting. If you're going to finish it more like a Marty Michelle, where you have the folded lip on the back, you need to leave a margin. I really have come to love the first two techniques, where you simply join your quilt blocks edge to edge with no sashing, and then add one piece of fabric for the batting. That's my preferred method. It may not be yours, but that's how I'm going to show you how to do this, so that we're going to create an edge-to-edge quilting design for this particular block. But before we do that edge-to-edge design, I want you to look down at the bottom, and I just truly realized this. My lettering is outside my hoop. Now, I can see that. This is the hoop also indicates the stitching area. But for this particular size of hoop and this particular size of stitching area, Embrilliance is going to give me every opportunity not to make a big mess of things. If you look at the bottom of my screen, you can see that bright red shouting out at me bar. that tells me my design is too big for this hoop. I just noticed that. And I've been an Embrilliance user for quite a while now. But how cool is that? You know, I love discovering new things. Let's go ahead and return to our 8-inch quilting block. And we have our 3 objects in the object pane. We have our initial outline, our batting placement, our fabric holding. This initial outline is going to be stitched on my backing, my no-show mesh, maybe water-soluble stabilizer, whatever you use to initially stitch this or to give yourself some a surface upon which to stitch. My batting placement is going to tack my batting down, and after you do this, you stop and you trim your batting. And then my fabric holding stitch is going to be done after I place my top fabric, and I like to do that in water-soluble thread. I know I didn't mention this earlier. This is giving you a preview of what's coming next. And the reason I do that is just in case my stitching's a little bit off, it will eventually not show on the top of my quilt. But let's go ahead and create our edge-to-edge quilting design. With that said, I'm going to take my batting placement and I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it. Again, now I have 4 objects. Click off, go back to my batting placement, select the color, and I'm going to make it green. I don't like that color green. That way, again, I have a whole different area. Now, what's going to happen as I'm stitching this out? My quilting is going to come up to that batting placement line. And I'm going to, because this is 1/8 of an inch, it is almost minuscule. Remember, there's a roll to your fabric. When I actually stitch my blocks one to the other, I'm going to stitch in between the outline and the new quilting outline. We're going to change that name. So we're going to go quilting outline. And I'm going to stitch between them. Because this is a quilting outline, and remember, look at your toggles up here, I am in the design menu. This part of it can actually be done in Embrilliance or Enthusiast so that you can bring in quilting designs from someplace else. Once you've created that 8-inch block, you can now work with it in many, many ways. But let's create it. So let's go to the Create Design menu. And with my quilting outline selected, I'm going to change my stitch. Currently, it is a running stitch. I'm going to, just for simplicity's sake, make it a stippled area. By clicking on that, I now have a stippled stitch that goes all the way to the edge of where my batting is. I can adjust my stitching by selecting the object. Now remember, we have to be in the Create Design to do this. And I can space it a little bit larger if I don't want it tightly stippled. And there you have an almost finished quilt block. And now I'm going to take this to the machine and show you the tricks to stitching. Hi all. Now we're going to talk about what we need in order to actually stitch out our 8-inch quilt block. The first thing we're going to need is the hoop that we set our machine up to sew, or our design up to sew. This is my Janome ASQ22. It is my absolute favorite hoop. I love quilting in it because you can set your quilt in it, you can center it, you can do all sorts of things. It's got this great little template, and it just works beautifully, magnetically held in the hoop. The next thing that I need is I'm going to need a no-show mesh for my backing. Now, when you're doing quilt in the hoop, you can sew on some battings, but those battings have to be stabilized in some way, shape, or form. Hoop Sisters has a batting battleizer, and the stabilizer is included. It's a very nice batting, but it's a little bit pricey. This is a no-show mesh, and I purchased it off of Amazon. And there's a lot of companies that sell it. You can get the fusible or the non-fusible. I prefer the non-fusible. It's very, very lightweight. I've discovered that when it's laundered, the hand is soft, so it doesn't make my quilt stiff. The other thing that I've discovered is that it actually goes into the seam great. So if I screw up on my seam allowances on my fabric, I still have this to help me make up for my seams. Finally, it's not going to show, especially in a quilt where you're going to place a single fabric on the back for your backing. It does give a nice, it's nice and, I want to say firm. It doesn't stretch, okay? There's no give to this particular mesh. So it's going to hold your batting nice and level as you stitch your stitches. I cut this piece about an inch larger than my hoop so that I have adequate hooping space. The next thing that I have is my fabric. This is the upper fabric, and today I'm using white so you can see the stitches. And this is simply muslin today, but batiks work great with this particular quilting technique. Anything you want, and we're going to get to that in later videos. I've starched it just a little bit, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to finger press. I'm going to fold it into quarters and finger press it so that I have my actual, I've got centers marked. Alright, now the cut size of this is 9.5 inches. I'm stitching an 8-inch finished block, so 9.5 gives me plenty of seam allowances on all sides. It also works well because I just happen to have an Omnigrid ruler that is 9.5 inches square. Finally, my batting. This particular batting is a very thin batting. Hang on, I'm coming. And what you see in front of you is a polyester cotton blend. This batting I purchased at Joann's, and it's called Soft and Craft. And I believe it is that Joann's distributes this, and they have numbers according to the thickness, and I believe this is the number 1. Anyway, it's the thinnest one that they have. And the distance for quilting is anywhere between 5 and 10 centimeters, but I want to talk about that distance in quilting now. Part of the distance in quilting when you're doing a traditional quilt with the 3 layers is to hold all of your layers together. Remember, you have a stabilizer that your batting is going to be stitched to. So as long as you maintain that 5 to 10 centimeters, or that roughly 2, I'm trying to think in my head, 2 to 5 inch distance on your quilting, you're going to be fine. It's going to work exactly as the manufacturers have planned this batting, or whatever batting you choose to use. My actual favorite is Warm and Natural. It is 100% cotton, and it's a nice, it just stitches well. It's got a nice feel to it when it's finished. It's got a nice feel to it while you're stitching, and it really does stay in place. It also, in one of the steps that I'm going to show you, we trim out our batting. This particular batting, because it's polyester, is a little bit more difficult to trim around your stitching. I get what I call whispers, and you'll see that when I'm trimming. The Warm and Natural doesn't give me that same result. It actually trims very clean against the stitching and makes for a nice clean edge of my batting. But here's my batting cut, and again, I cut it at 9.5. Go to the machine. Let me talk about thread. I use Aurifil. I like the weight. It's nice and thin. It's very durable. When I tack down, or when I do my placement stitch on my mesh, the first stitch I'm going to do, the first box we created, I use 2 different colors threads. I use one that blends with the mesh in the needle, white, off-white, the real pale gray, depending. It's what I've got. And in my bobbin, I will use a different color. And I usually choose a gray because when this is all finished, I want to be able to see my outline stitch for my block and my batting tacking stitch. Those are going to be my guidelines for assembling the quilt blocks. So I want to be able to see that and not question where that particular stitching is. I do change to a white or whatever color bobbin, off-white, neutral color, when I'm doing my stippling stitch, but with all of my straight stitches I will use this stitch. I also change when I'm doing my fabric tacking stitch to a water-soluble thread. That way, if I should make say I don't do this. I wish I didn't. A wobbly stitch when I'm stitching my blocks together, this will wash out, and I will never see that there was a stitching line there. Now, let's go to the machine. Okay, I have my machine, my design uploaded to my machine, and I have my hoop calibrated according to my machine's directions, and now I'm getting ready to sew. I've already pulled up the bobbin thread, so I'm going to start my stitching, and I made a mistake because I didn't pull it all under the hoop, so I'm going to stop my machine right now and do that, and trim my tails. I'm going to let this first outline stitch complete its path around the machine, and I have a feeling it's going to be kind of hard to see. There we go. If you look closely, it's kind of hard to see even if with the dark color, you can see that I have a straight stitch square stitched out on my mesh. Now that is the placement stitch for my batting. The next step is to place the batting in that stitch. Now this is a little tricky. You don't want to get your fingers caught. You can actually place a little bit of Elmer School glue right at the corners to help hold it down. Of course now my glue stick's glued shut. Just on the corners of the no-show mesh. And it works okay. Not great, but okay. And I'm going to place my quilt batting over the stitching. And I'm going to begin stitching again, bringing my, I have a first start stop on my machine. I'm going to allow that second square that we created to be stitched. And I'm going to keep my fingers far away from that needle. And now I'm actually going to remove my hoop from my machine. And you want to do this on a flat surface, because if you don't, you're going to get yourself into trouble as far as your hooping. I'm going to trim away my tails again. And I have my hoop sister scissors. Duck-billed scissors work, applique scissors work. There's a new one I want to get because these are starting to get a little bit dull. I've used them for a lot. The trick to trimming away the batting is you want to trim up to, right next to that stitching line, right next to the stitching line, but not through it. The easiest way is to simply hold the batting straight up as you trim around it. I'm having a hard time with words today. I think it's because I got a cold. And you just trim all the way around. Remember I said this with the polyester is a little bit difficult to trim out. Let me get this first edge done and I'll show you what I mean. Stuck. Okay, let's look at this first edge. I'll turn it around. Hopefully you'll be able to see it a little bit more closely. It's not too bad actually. It's right up against that stitching. I do have a few areas that are a little bit wider, so I'm just going to trim them out. But I'm going to do that on all the edges of my batting. Okay, I have all the edges of my batting trimmed, and here's one of those whiskers or whispers I was talking about, but it's nice and snug up close to that tacking stitch. The next thing I'm going to do is add my fabric. Now remember, I finger pressed it, and this one I really didn't do a good job pressing the whole piece of fabric. But I have my fabric quartered, and I'm going to be following the lines or the markings that I put on my hoop as far as quartering something. You can see the black, it's actually electrical tape I think, or no, auto detailing tape. And you can see those black lines, and I'm going to open it up, that's about in the center, a little bit less. And I'm going to make sure I have a good 3/4 of an inch over my batting. The goal is not to be, you don't want this cut edge of your fabric any closer than 1/2 inch to your batting at the greatest, but 3/4 is better. Trust me on that one. The next thing that we're going to stitch is going to be our fabric tacking stitch. Normally I would put water-soluble thread in, but I'm going to leave my darker gray thread in this time so that you can actually see where this tacking stitch lays. Easy peasy, that's done. Now I want you to look at it and you can see I love the way the edge looks. It just hugs right up to that batting and I don't have any excess space. Now, like I said, if this were water-soluble thread in the final quilt, it would wash out. But now it's time to do our stippling. I'm going to change the color of my thread and I am going to quilt my block. Maybe, there we go. One stitch stop, thread to the top, pull tails up, and start stitching. And our quilt block is done. Let's trim it. Okay, so now I have my completed quilt block. And remember I said my old eyes don't like having to work really hard to see. As we turn over the quilt block, you can see that the two different outline stitches stand out just tremendously. This first outline stitch, the one right along here, is going to be my guideline for trimming. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to find my 1/2 inch mark and place it on the quilted guideline. I apologize for the glare. It's really bad. You can see where I've got my quilted guideline and my 1/2 inch mark. And I'm going to trim all 4 sides of my block down to 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I move everything away. The unfortunate side of the no mesh is that you tend to waste quite a bit of it. And that's always concerns me. I'm working on a workaround for it. And I should have it pretty well near publishment in the next 6 weeks. So, and hopefully it won't cost too much money. Rather buy fabric. So now I have my quilt block trimmed out. Let me make sure that looked a little wonky. And it's perfect. 1/2 inch seam allowances on all sides. And it's time to assemble. Let's assemble our blocks. I'm going to be using, you can tell it's an old smocking block board that I made. It's a cork board. They're not very expensive if you want to try the same idea, but it can also be accomplished on an ironing board surface that has a little bit of padding, and you'll see why in a moment. So I have my blocks, and I have 2 of them created just so I could show you this, and I'm going to actually take, and I'm going to use pins to begin with, and I'm going to place a pin through the outer corner. Remember, placement, batting, up at the corner of the placement stitch. Now because my placement stitch mimics the stitch that I used to hold my fabric down, I'm going to take that pin and match my corner right there. Stick it into the cork board. I'm also going to do the same thing on the other corner. Pin through the corner into the corner opposite. Now I'm going to roll my seam back and make sure that those 2 seam allowances, or those 2 seam lines, actually correspond one to the other, and I'm going to place a pin there. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take these nice little clips, which I love for batting, I love for just about anything anymore, and I'm going to work it under all of the layers of these 2 quilt blocks. And I'm going to clamp them in position. Now let's say I have a point right here on my quilt block. I would match that point. Okay, I would be sure to match it. If I'm having trouble because this pin is holding both layers together at the same spot, I can kind of scooch it up, get my big hands out of the way, and run my quilt clamp there. The other 2 places I place these little clips, and I place the clear side to the side that's going to be held against the machine bed, is about 1.5 inches away from the corners. 1 to 1.5 inches away. I want to be able to get it under my presser foot without moving the clamp. And this actually holds it very snugly and very securely. I have minimal problems with it slipping out of position when I put these there. Now, if you're new to quilting, the last thing you might want to do is mark your seam allowances so you know exactly where your 1/2 inch seam allowance is. And I do use that 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I will put my ruler down and just extend it. That way, there's no doubt where I'm headed on my sewing machine. Let's take a closer look at that. I'll remove my pins. I don't need them anymore. And you can see I have my seams, the extension drawing. I hope it shows up. And I'm going to take this and show you how quick and easy it is to put this block together. I have my machine set for straight stitch. For a straight stitch, I am not going to use my 1/4 inch foot because I have a 1/2 inch seam line. I have gotten used to using my AccuFeed with an open toe just because I want to be able to clearly see between the 2 stitching lines that are on my quilt block. I set my length at around 2.3 to 2.6. I don't want it too loose, but I don't want it too tight either. And then I'll begin stitching at the end and just stitch along in between my 2 stitching lines. Let's see what that's going to look like. Okay, I've stopped my needle. I'm hopefully going to zoom in and show you exactly where the needle is laying. There we go. You see how close it comes between those 2? And that's really a good thing. Let me finish the seam. Okay, let's look at our seam. I have to say that is absolutely perfect. Now that gray shadowing that you see right there, if that is water soluble, that will completely go away when this quilt block is stitched, but it looks it's perfect. It looks like just one continuous design. At my iron, I will press this seam open like that. It makes a nice flat seam in my quilt. And then I would actually put this on one large piece of fabric, quilt in the ditch here, and finish it off. You might wonder about the lack of batting here. 2 things: borders to come, and maybe other quilt blocks. I hope you've enjoyed starting out with this. Until next time, bye.